Ethan was a man of routines, lost between stunning photographs and bitter memories. His name was known in the art world, but his personal life, invisible to most, was full of shadows. The loss of his mother had left a void that not even success could fill. It was strange, he thought, how the world applauded him for capturing the beauty of nature, while inside him, everything seemed inhospitable. Ethan preferred the silence of the mountains to the family conversations he avoided at all costs. Grace, his older sister, was a constant reminder of the past. The two had grown apart years ago after a fight he couldn't even remember how it started, but whose scars still haunted him. Not that he was proud, but the wounds seemed too deep to heal easily. Thus, he threw himself headfirst into his work, capturing the harshness of the world while avoiding the harshness of his own life. His apartment, filled with cameras and lenses, was his refuge, a place where he controlled what he saw, unlike the unpredictable reality of human relationships. The camera, his eternal companion, was also his shield. With it, Ethan could observe the world without having to interact for real. What he saw in nature, the arid landscapes, the strong winds, the sudden weather changes, reflected his own feelings. But behind the impeccable images, there was a man struggling with the weight of isolation. There was something in the silence of the mountains that offered him momentary peace but also made him remember things he preferred to forget. Photography was his escape and his burden. Every image he took seemed like an attempt to fill the void inside him, but nothing seemed sufficient. Nights were long and lonely, and memories of his mother and the relationship he once had with Grace were ghosts he couldn't shake off. No matter how hard he tried to focus on work, something inside him always pulled him back to that uncomfortable reality. Deep down, he knew there were unfinished issues that needed to be addressed, even if he wasn't ready for them. It was during these solitary expeditions to the mountains that Ethan felt the freest, even though he was also more vulnerable. Nature, with its brutality and beauty, reminded him of the very contradictions of his life. He was there, capturing the world through his lenses, but he couldn't capture his own emotions. Every click was an attempt to understand what was wrong, but the answer always seemed to slip away, like the wind blowing in the mountains. Ethan's exhibitions were acclaimed, viewed by thousands who admired his ability to portray the raw truth of life. But for him, that truth was becoming increasingly distant. How could he capture others' suffering if he could never face his own? His mother's words, the few he still remembered, echoed in his mind. Never stray from what is important, Ethan. But he had strayed. And that thought disturbed him, though he refused to admit it. His professional success was undeniable, but even with all that, Ethan didn't feel complete. He knew something was missing, that Grace's absence in his life was like a pebble in his shoe, a constant discomfort he couldn't ignore any longer. It was ironic how he, who spent his life trying to capture the essence of the human being, was so disconnected from those closest to him. Pride and pain prevented him from taking the first step, from trying a reconciliation that seemed impossible. At the end of each day, when he reviewed his photos, Ethan felt a mix of accomplishment and frustration. He knew his images told stories of overcoming and pain, but ironically, he himself seemed trapped in his own unfinished narrative. And even without wanting to, something inside him made him wish to change that, even if he didn't know where to start. But fate, unexpectedly, had other plans for him. Something was about to happen that would completely change the course of his life. During one of these mountain expeditions, while searching for the perfect angle for another one of his photographs, Ethan came across something that would change everything. At first, it was just a distant sight, a blurred silhouette in the snow. But as he approached, he saw that it was more than a scene to be captured. It was a man, elderly, accompanied by a child, both struggling against the biting cold. And it was at that moment that everything began to change. The sight of Henry and Jack, lost in the cold, hit Ethan like a sudden wave. There they were, in the midst of a white vastness, two fragile figures struggling against something much greater than themselves. He couldn't ignore that scene, not this time. Instinctively, the photographer lowered his camera and ran toward the two. Henry, the elderly man, was trying to protect little Jack from the icy wind, using his worn-out coat as a shield. The image of helplessness was so powerful that Ethan felt his heart tighten. As he approached, Ethan noticed Henry's tired eyes, which filled with relief upon seeing someone coming his way. Without exchanging many words, Ethan offered help. "You need a warm place," he said, his voice firm but gentle. Henry, too exhausted to argue, simply nodded. Ethan knew that this offer of shelter could alter the course of his own plans, but there was something about that man and that child that touched him in a different way. He couldn't just move on and ignore what he had just witnessed. They walked slowly, the snow hindering their progress, but Ethan was determined. The cabin he used as a refuge during his photographic expeditions wasn't far away. The biting wind made the cold seem even more relentless, but the human warmth that was beginning to grow between them gave Ethan a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. As they walked, the photographer remembered his mother's words, echoing in his mind, "Always help those in need, Ethan. The world already has enough suffering." Ethan felt an internal struggle. Part of him was focused on his upcoming photographic exhibition, and another part was beginning to realize that this encounter wasn't a mere coincidence. "I should be taking photos now, capturing the raw power of nature," he thought. However, the cameras he now carried seemed insignificant in the face of the reality unfolding before him. Real life, there at that moment, was much more impactful than any image he could capture. As they continued toward the cabin, Ethan began to think about what his help truly meant. Offering shelter to strangers in a situation like that was more than a matter of solidarity. It was a choice that could change everything, for them and for him. Looking at Jack, who followed silently beside his grandfather, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. "Maybe there's something more here, something I still don't fully understand," he thought. Upon reaching the cabin, Ethan opened the door and invited them in. The warmth of the fire in the hearth immediately began to warm their frozen bodies. Henry sighed, as if the weight of the world was being lifted from his shoulders. Jack, still shy, looked around with curiosity but also with some apprehension. Ethan realized that that gesture of welcome was small compared to what those two souls had already faced. He knew that their true journey of overcoming was just beginning. As he prepared something warm for everyone, Ethan watched the two. Henry looked exhausted but grateful. Jack, despite his age, had a sadness in his eyes that Ethan recognized, like a mirror of what he himself had felt so many times in life. They have been through so much, he thought. And suddenly, helping Henry and Jack ceased to be a matter of momentary kindness. Ethan found himself involved in a way he didn't expect. Ethan, now beside the fire, began to feel a weight on his shoulders, not from the cold, but from the responsibility he had taken on. He knew that his decision to help them didn't end there. As he watched the flames crackle, a silent question arose: how far was he willing to go? He knew that this encounter was not just about physical survival. Something bigger was at stake, something he still didn't fully understand. There, sitting by the hearth, the warmth bringing a false sense of security, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had gotten too involved. His thoughts were a jumble. The photographic exhibition was approaching, his colleagues expected results, and he had responsibilities to fulfill. How could he balance all that and still take care of Henry and Jack? That feeling of hope and compassion, which minutes before had driven him, now seemed to slowly fade, replaced by doubts. Ethan had always had a tendency to avoid deep emotional bonds. He dedicated himself to his photos, to his landscapes, because nature, as imposing as it was, demanded nothing from him but admiration and respect. People, however, were complicated, and now he found himself in a situation that required more than he was used to giving. Watching Henry and Jack fall asleep, the weight of that decision began to press even harder. "Am I ready for this?" he thought. The exhibition he had been preparing was the largest of his career, and he had dedicated months to making everything perfect. Diverting his attention now seemed risky, almost irresponsible. The two strangers he had taken in with their unknown life stories put him in a position he didn't know he wanted to maintain. Maybe he should let them go their way or seek some other form of help. The doubt was relentless, and the fear of failing professionally grew with each minute. However, something inside him resisted the idea of abandoning them. The image of Jack, huddled beside his grandfather, reminded him of himself as a child, seeking safety in a world that didn't always offer easy answers. The internal conflict intensified. Ethan didn't want to give up his work, but at the same time, something deeper was happening there. He felt pulled into this journey, even if reluctantly, and the very idea of giving up made him feel incomplete. The following days brought a strange routine. Ethan tried to balance his time between preparing the exhibition and taking care of Henry and Jack. Every time he thought about suggesting they continue their way, something held him back. He knew that his presence there at that moment was important to them, but at the same time, he feared that this connection would distract him from his own goals. And so, the dilemma continued, like an invisible weight he carried. Ethan began to realize that the time with Henry and Jack was changing something inside him. The conversations they had, though brief, brought up feelings he had buried long ago. There was something familiar in that dynamic, something that made him reflect on his own life, on the choices he had made. But the feeling of losing control still haunted him. He didn't know how far this help would take him, and that terrified him. One night, after spending hours reviewing his photos and trying to adjust the last details of the exhibition, Ethan felt a deep exhaustion. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He knew he was on the brink of an important decision, either commit truly to Henry and Jack or find a way to distance himself. The problem was that the more time passed, the harder it seemed to make that decision. Ethan felt he was stuck between professional duty and the need to reconnect with something greater. While Henry and Jack slept, Ethan went outside the cabin. The intense cold hit him immediately, but he didn't mind. Looking up at the starry sky, he remembered his mother's words, something she always said when he was younger: "Sometimes what seems like a distraction is actually the path you need to follow." Ethan sighed. Even after her passing, she still seemed present in moments like that, like a calm and welcoming voice in his mind. He remembered the lessons she taught him since childhood. Be kind to others, Ethan. The world needs more kindness. And at that moment, Henry's face in the firelight brought those memories back overwhelmingly. His mother had always been his greatest inspiration. When he was a child, she taught him the importance of looking beyond appearances, of seeing what people carried inside. Ethan, on many occasions, tried to apply those lessons in his art, capturing the essence of human life in his photographs. However, it was much easier to do that behind a camera than to deal with the complexities of real life. Now, sitting with Henry and Jack, he felt those lessons were more alive than ever. He wondered how his mother would have reacted to that situation. She certainly wouldn't have hesitated to offer shelter to strangers. Ethan remembered all the time she helped people in need, opening the doors of their home to those who needed it. "There's always room for one more," she would say. And that's what he was doing now, following her teachings, even if hesitantly. His mother was the silent voice guiding him, even if he wasn't aware of it all the time. The memory of his mother also challenged him. He knew his mother expected more from him, that he would go beyond his own insecurities and fears. And that was the hard part. Ethan had always felt inadequate compared to the high standards of generosity his mother had set. Now, helping Henry and Jack, he had the opportunity to finally honor those lessons in a way he had never done before. Henry, unknowingly, also seemed to play a mentor role for Ethan. Every time the elderly man shared his life stories, Ethan saw himself reflected in them, as if they were mirrors of his own dilemmas. Henry's simple words, full of a wisdom that only time can provide, made Ethan begin to see things from another perspective. Perhaps his life, so focused on work and success, was lacking something deeper, something he couldn't see until that moment. The two spent hours talking on cold nights while Jack slept. Ethan listened attentively to Henry's stories about his youth, his losses, his personal battles. There was something in the way Henry spoke that reminded Ethan of his mother, as if she too had lived a life marked by compassion and sacrifices for others. What impressed Ethan the most was the serenity with which Henry spoke about his failures, as if they were just inevitable parts of the journey. Ethan began to realize that helping Henry and Jack wasn't just a gesture of solidarity but a lesson about himself. He was relearning what it meant to be human, to be vulnerable. There was something transformative in allowing himself to be touched by others' stories and experiences. And, as much as he still hesitated to fully open up, Henry's presence made him lower his guard, even if subtly. More than a mentor, Henry was becoming a paternal figure for Ethan, something he hadn't felt since his mother's death. The connection they were forming was deep, and Ethan knew it went beyond a simple act of kindness. There was an exchange happening there, something he still couldn't fully understand, but which was already beginning to change the way he saw the world around him. Days passed slowly in the cabin, and living with Henry and Jack was becoming something more meaningful than Ethan could have imagined. However, the reality of the outside world kept knocking on the door. Ethan's colleagues, especially those closer to the art scene, began to question his choices. "Are you really going to put your exhibition on the back burner because of two people you barely know?" they asked. It was hard for them to understand why such a talented photographer would interrupt his biggest project for something so uncertain. These questions made him doubt himself. What was he doing? Maybe his friends were right. He had a name to uphold, a promising career, and he was at the peak of his profession. His exhibition was about to happen, and the expectation was high. Ethan wondered if he was throwing everything away on a whim of kindness, on a feeling that might lead nowhere. He had always been so dedicated to work, and now he found himself torn between following the path he had set and this new reality that seemed to pull him in another direction. Despite the criticisms, there was a voice encouraging him to continue. His photographic mentor, a wise figure who had followed his career from the beginning, saw things differently. True art, Ethan, comes from moments like these. Capturing the essence of the human being is more important than any exhibition. These words resonated strongly, making Ethan begin to see things from another perspective. His mentor understood that this experience, as challenging as it was shaping Ethan as a person and as an artist. Ethan also found unexpected allies on his journey. The small community near the mountains, upon learning about Henry and Jack's situation, offered help. A neighbor, who was a doctor, came to the cabin to check Henry's health, and a woman from the village brought warm clothes and food. Ethan felt grateful but at the same time pressured. Every gesture of solidarity seemed to reinforce the idea that he needed to keep helping, but his internal conflicts only grew. The biggest test, however, came from within Ethan. His own mind was his most relentless enemy. He constantly found himself questioning if he was up to the situation, if he really had the capacity to make a difference in Henry and Jack's lives. "I'm just a photographer," he thought. The fear of failure, both personally and professionally, haunted him. He wanted to believe he was doing the right thing, but the insecurity continued to whisper in his ear. Meanwhile, Jack began to open up more to Ethan. The boy, who was initially shy and reserved, started sharing his small joys and curiosities. Ethan saw himself as a protective figure for the boy, something he never imagined he could be. This bond forming with Jack brought a sense of responsibility that went beyond what he was used to handling. It was something new, something that challenged his emotional barriers but also motivated him to continue. And then there was Henry, always with a wise word but never pressuring Ethan to do anything. The elderly man seemed to understand Ethan's internal conflicts without him needing to say a word. "Sometimes, helping others ends up helping us too, even if it doesn't seem like it at first," Henry said on a quiet night. These words were etched in Ethan's mind, as if they were an echo of the lessons his mother used to give him. He began to realize that this journey wasn't just about saving Henry and Jack but about finding something that was lost within himself. The exhibition was approaching, and Ethan still hadn't decided what he would do. He knew he needed to return to the city, but he also knew that the experience in the cabin had changed something inside him. His colleagues continued to pressure him, while his mentor encouraged him to follow his heart. The days in the cabin were becoming more than just an act of kindness. They were an opportunity for growth and reconnection with parts of himself he had left behind. As days passed, Ethan and Henry developed a connection that went beyond words. The silence between them was comfortable, as if the stories Henry told on cold nights were a way for Ethan to understand more about life and, ironically, about himself. One night, Henry decided to open his heart and shared something that deeply shocked Ethan. Jack, the boy he protected as if he were his grandson, was not his blood relative. "I found Jack when he was just a baby, abandoned on the street. I couldn't leave him there. So I took him and have been taking care of him since then." Ethan was stunned. The love Henry had for Jack was unquestionable, And the revelation that the boy wasn't his biological grandson only reinforced the depth of that man's character. "I did what I could," Henry continued. "I don't have much, but I tried to give him a better life." Henry's words resonated with Ethan, and he felt a tightness in his chest as he realized the magnitude of the sacrifice Henry had made. The story made him reflect on his own life and the things he had distanced himself from, especially his family. That revelation plunged Ethan into thoughts about the meaning of family. He had distanced himself from Grace for so long that the idea of reuniting with her seemed impossible. But somehow, Henry's stories about loss and sacrifice made him think that maybe there was a chance for redemption. Ethan knew that pride had kept him away from his sister for many years, but now, life was putting a mirror before him that forced him to confront his choices. As Henry continued to share stories of his youth, Ethan began to ask questions about Henry's past, trying to understand more about his life before Jack. Henry revealed that he had been estranged from his own family due to financial issues and had never had the chance to meet his children or grandchildren. "It's hard, you know? You do what you can, but sometimes the world has other plans for you," Henry said, with a distant look. Ethan felt a connection to those words, as if they were speaking directly about his own relationship with Grace. Living with Henry and Jack made Ethan reflect even more on what truly mattered in life. He had spent so many years dedicating himself to photography, capturing the suffering and beauty of the world, but he had never stopped to look at his own wounds. Henry and Jack, with their stories of struggle and resilience, brought to light a side of Ethan he didn't know still existed: the desire to reconnect with his own family, to heal old wounds. With each new story from Henry, Ethan felt as if he was being taken inside himself, a place where his long-buried emotions were finally surfacing. Henry's words made him realize that the distance between him and Grace was something he needed to face, just as Henry had faced his own losses. It was an intense emotional journey, and Ethan knew that in some way, that encounter was preparing him for something greater. The days in the cabin, alongside Henry and Jack, became a sort of healing process for Ethan. He wasn't just helping the two survive the cold, he was also rediscovering himself. Henry was a constant reminder that life is full of sacrifices but also opportunities for redemption. And Ethan knew that, just as Henry found a new family in Jack, maybe he too could find a way to reconnect with Grace. Ethan began to see that the pain of the past, the distance between him and his sister, was something he needed to confront head-on. Henry's story, of being estranged from his family, touched Ethan in a profound way. It was as if the universe was giving him a second chance, an opportunity to do what Henry never had the chance to do: reunite his family before it was too late. And this idea began to gain more and more strength within him. Living with Jack also brought a new perspective to Ethan. The boy, despite all the hardships, still carried an innocence and joy that touched Ethan in an unexpected way. Jack, unknowingly, was showing Ethan what true resilience was: the ability to find hope even in the most difficult circumstances. And this made Ethan realize that, perhaps, he too could find a way to rebuild his own life. Ethan, with all the closeness to Henry, looked at him and saw in the elderly man's features something he couldn't identify but that deeply troubled him. Determined to understand better, Ethan began to discreetly investigate more about Henry's history. Something in his words about being estranged from his family sounded all too familiar. And it was then that, while flipping through some old documents left on the cabin table, he found a clue that would change everything: Grace's name among Henry's notes. The shock was immediate. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. How could Henry know Grace? How could their paths have crossed without him knowing? His mind raced for answers, but all he could see was the improbability of that situation. Determined to confront Henry, Ethan waited for the next morning, unable to sleep, with his mind fixed on those notes that could explain a connection he never imagined. The next morning, when Henry woke up, Ethan couldn't contain the question that was suffocating him inside. "Henry, what do you know about Grace? Why is her name in your papers?" Henry, surprised by the question, took a few seconds to respond. He lowered his eyes, as if he knew that moment would come. In a tired voice, he said, "Grace, she's my biological granddaughter. I never had the chance to meet her. Do you know her?" Henry's response was like a blow. Ethan fell silent, unable to process the truth he had just heard. Grace was Henry's biological granddaughter? That meant Henry was the grandfather she never mentioned, the man who, due to circumstances that were still unclear, had been estranged from the family. The revelation brought forth a confusion of feelings in Ethan: anger, sadness, surprise, but also a strange sense of destiny. How could he have reached this situation without knowing? Ethan stood up, needing air, needing to think. He left the cabin and walked through the snow, trying to find an explanation for what was happening. How he, who had distanced himself from his sister for so long, was now so unexpectedly connected to her again. Henry's story was, in a way, also his. Both had been estranged from someone they loved, both carried the weight of family separation. And now, suddenly, Ethan had the opportunity to correct something, to do what Henry had never been able to do: reunite his family. The revelation forced Ethan to confront his own emotions. He had always believed that the distance between him and Grace was insurmountable, an unbreakable barrier. But there, in front of Henry's story, he saw that maybe there was a chance for redemption, to make peace with his own past. The old man before him, who had lost so much, was now an inseparable part of his life and, more importantly, his sister's life. Ethan knew he couldn't ignore that. Ethan returned to the cabin, determined to talk more with Henry, to understand the details of his story and, somehow, find a way to share everything with Grace. But there was a fear inside him, a fear of how his sister would react. They had been apart for so long, how would she accept this truth? And more than that, how could Ethan help her deal with the fact that the grandfather she never knew was, suddenly, there, present, after so many years? As he talked with Henry, Ethan began to see the depth of that man's pain. Henry had not only lost his family but lost the opportunity to know his grandchildren, to be present in their lives. "I never thought I'd have another chance," Henry confessed, his eyes moist with emotion. "But now, with you here, maybe there's a way for me to reconcile with the past." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He was also seeking that reconciliation, though in a different way. And he knew that the next step would be the hardest of all. With the revelation, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility grow. He knew he would need to gather the strength to talk to Grace, to try to repair the broken ties and, somehow, bring Henry back into the family. But that was a trial he deeply feared. His relationship with Grace had always been delicate, and now, with this new truth, he felt the risk of losing everything was even greater. The decision to contact Grace hung in the air like an unbearable weight. Ethan knew that would be a decisive moment, not just for him but for everyone involved in that life's plot. He picked up the phone countless times, hesitated, put it back in his pocket. The fear of the unknown, of what could happen by reopening old wounds, paralyzed him. But at the same time, there was a voice inside him saying that this was the only way to move forward, not just for Henry, but for himself. That day, sitting by the fireplace, Ethan finally made the call. Grace's voice on the other end of the line was cold, distant. She seemed surprised to hear from her brother after so long, but there was no warmth he remembered from their childhood times. With a dry throat, Ethan began to explain, his words coming out in a choppy manner, as if each sentence required immense effort. "Grace, I met someone. Someone you need to meet. Is your grandfather?" On the other side, the silence was deafening. Grace didn't know what to say. Ethan could feel her hesitation, her shock, but also something more, a hint of curiosity. He knew she was processing everything he had just said, and that made him nervous. The silence stretched longer than he had imagined, until finally Grace responded, her voice still restrained. "My grandfather? Ethan, what are you talking about?" He explained what he had discovered about Henry, about the family estrangement, and how fate had put them on the same path. Grace's reaction wasn't immediate. Ethan knew she would need time to assimilate everything, but to his surprise, Grace agreed to go to the cabin to meet Henry. "I can't promise anything, Ethan. I don't know what this means, but I'll go." That simple sentence brought immense relief to Ethan. He knew that meeting could change everything, that there might be a chance to heal the past wounds. And, at that moment, he realized he was willing to do whatever was necessary to reconnect the family. The days leading up to Grace's arrival were filled with anticipation. Ethan found himself on an emotional roller coaster, oscillating between hope and fear of what was to come. He knew that reuniting with Henry could bring both joy and pain. But the mere fact that Grace had agreed to come was a small victory. Henry, for his part, was anxious but also prepared for whatever might come. "I don't expect miracles, Ethan. I just want to see her, just want to have the chance to ask for forgiveness, if that's the case." When Grace finally arrived at the cabin, the moment was one of palpable tension. She entered hesitantly, her eyes wandering around the room until they settled on Henry, who was sitting in an armchair near the fire. The look they exchanged was loaded with emotions that words couldn't express. Grace stood still for a moment, as if she was trying to process everything at once. Henry, for his part, slowly stood up, his eyes moist. "Grace, you have no idea how long I've waited for this moment." Ethan remained silent, letting the moment belong to them. It was a reunion that transcended any expectations he could have had. Grace, with tears in her eyes, slowly approached Henry. There was a mixture of pain and relief in her expression. "Why were you never there?" she asked, her voice choked. Henry, with a soft voice, replied, "Because life took me away from you, but never from my love for you." Henry's words broke down any remaining resistance in Grace. She hugged him, and in that embrace, Ethan saw the reward he had been seeking so much: the family's reconciliation. The moment was cathartic for everyone. Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had done what seemed impossible, brought together the fragments of a family that had been broken for so long. There was a profound sense of relief, but also renewal. That embrace between Grace and Henry represented something much greater than the simple act of forgiveness. It was a chance to start anew, to build something new from the ruins of the past. Henry and Grace's reunion not only brought relief and tears but also ignited a new spark of hope in Ethan's life. In the days that followed, something inside him began to change profoundly. He realized that the simple act of bringing his sister together with the grandfather she never knew had a much greater impact than he had imagined. The feeling of renewal was palpable. For the first time in years, Ethan felt part of something bigger, as if the void left by Grace's distance was finally being filled. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was constant. Ethan and Grace began to spend more time together. Conversations that once seemed impossible now flowed naturally. It was as if Henry's presence had undone all the barriers that existed between them. Ethan felt he was rediscovering his sister, and with that, rediscovering himself. He couldn't help but think about how much he had lost by distancing himself from her for so long, but now, with this new opportunity, he was determined not to repeat the same mistakes. Grace, for her part, was also transforming. The anger and resentment she had carried for so long began to dissipate. Henry's presence in her life, even if belated, brought a sense of healing she had never imagined possible. Jack, with his silent joy, also contributed to the atmosphere of renewal. The child, who was once just a shy presence, now became the link that united everyone. Grace, who had always longed to be a mother, found in Jack an unexpected opportunity to offer love and protection. The relationship between Ethan and Jack also blossomed. The photographer, who once saw the boy only as a fragile being to be protected, now saw him as a source of inspiration. Jack, with his resilience, showed Ethan what it truly meant to overcome adversity. The bond that formed between them went beyond what was expected, and Ethan began to see life through the eyes of that child, realizing that hope can arise even in the darkest moments. Ethan, Henry, Grace, and Jack now formed a new family unit. A family that, despite all the difficulties and unexpected paths, had found a way to reunite. The nights in the cabin, once filled with painful silences, were now filled with light conversations and laughter. The fire in the hearth, which once seemed only a way to warm their bodies, now represented the warmth of a new beginning. Ethan, who had spent so much time away from everything and everyone, saw himself emotionally reborn. Ethan's photographic exhibition was approaching, but he no longer felt the same pressure as before. He knew his work was important, but now there was something greater in his life. Henry, Grace, and Jack had awakened a new purpose in him. He didn't just want to capture beautiful or shocking images. He wanted to capture the human essence, the connection, the overcoming, the hope. And he knew that this new phase of his artistic life would be much more meaningful than anything he had done before. When the day of the exhibition finally arrived, Ethan showcased not only his landscape and impactful scene photographs but also images of Henry, Jack, and Grace. Sincere portraits that showed not just their faces but their stories. The reactions were immediate. The audience was moved by seeing those images full of life and resilience. Ethan knew he had found his true path as a photographer, a path that honored the lessons of compassion and empathy his mother had taught him. He not only regained his relationship with Grace but also found a new family in Henry and Jack. The void that once consumed him was now filled with love, connection, and a renewed purpose. That lonely man who had isolated himself in his icy landscapes now saw himself warmed by the love and hope that blossomed in his life. And although the path had been full of trials, he knew that, in the end, he had found the most precious reward of all. And so, Ethan's journey, marked by losses and reconciliations, reached a point of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that, regardless of the challenges that came, he was prepared to face them. The resurrection of his soul had occurred, and now he walked back into life with the certainty that the wounds of the past would no longer define him. He was ready to start anew, with a new family and a new vision of the world. Upon returning to his normal life, Ethan carried with him the wisdom he had gained on that journey. He had learned that helping others, even when it seemed like a detour, was actually the right path to follow. The exhibition he had so feared to set aside ended up being a success, not only because of the photos he displayed but because of the story they told. The story of overcoming, hope, and renewal that he experienced with Henry and Jack was there, printed in every image, and the audience could feel it. Reuniting with Grace also brought him an inner peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The distance that separated them, a barrier that seemed insurmountable, was naturally dissolved. Ethan knew that the path of reconciliation wasn't simple, but now he was willing to walk it, one step at a time. Jack's presence, who soon became like a son to Grace, symbolized the beginning of a new era for all of them. The boy, with his energy and resilience, brought a lightness to their lives they didn't even know they needed. Henry, for his part, found in the company of Grace and Jack what he had lost so long ago, a family. Ethan watched how the grandfather and granddaughter approached each other, how Henry spoke to Jack with the tenderness of a man who knew the value of time and second chances. Seeing this family dynamic flourish before his eyes made Ethan reflect on the power of empathy and reconciliation. He knew that life would never be the same, and honestly, he didn't want it to be. With this new wisdom, Ethan began to apply these lessons in everything he did. His photographic career, though still important, now had a different purpose. He sought to capture stories not just of beauty but of pain and resilience, of connection and overcoming. Ethan committed to using his work to shed light on people's lives, showing what is often invisible to the common eye. He wanted his photos to be more than beautiful images. He wanted them to be windows to the human soul. Furthermore, Ethan reconnected with something he had lost over the years, his own sense of belonging. Before, he isolated himself, both in his work and in his emotions. Now, he understood the value of being present, of sharing his life with those he loved. Alongside Grace, Henry, and Jack, Ethan felt he finally had a family again, something he didn't even know he desired until he found it. He knew that this feeling of belonging, of acceptance, was the greatest achievement he could attain. As the snow began to melt in the mountains, marking the end of a harsh winter and the beginning of a new season, Ethan felt that his life was also in transition. He was prepared for whatever came next, with a lighter heart and a renewed soul. The journey that began as a simple act of compassion led him down a path of self-discovery, and he knew that from now on, every step he took would be guided by this newfound wisdom.